Everything is proceeding as I have foreseen.
And they're wondering, is provisionism heresy, i.e. their views that our sin nature doesn't carry any penalty in and of itself, and that they deny total inability, two things even Wesleyans don't deny?
I have never heard of this. I don't know what provisionism is.
Gotcha.
Can you explain that a little more to me?
It's a soteriological view that has been made popular by a man named Leighton Flowers.
I've never heard of him.
Emotional damage.
Right.
Calvinism distorts the nature and the character of God, distorting the character and the nature of God, misrepresentation of God, misrepresent the character and the nature of God. We do believe it leads to fatalistic ways of thinking. We do believe it leads to misrepresentations of the character and the nature of God. We understand you don't believe that it misrepresents the character and the nature of God, but you have to understand from our perspective, the claims of your system seem to logically entail a misrepresentation of the nature and the character of God. Is the how question. And the point I'm trying to get to is that some would say that you're undermining God's character by saying that he determines rape and murder and Holocaust and all these things. And that's how he knows it, is because he actually determined for the molester to molest.
Or
and so some people are willing to sacrifice, right? Some people are willing to sacrifice an attribute of God's ability in order to protect what they think is necessary to protect the attribute of his character, because they see character as more important than ability. For example, if I say you can't bench press very much, that's not probably going to be as much of an insult as if I say you don't really love all your children, because that's an attack on your character, and you wouldn't want to be your character attacked. So somebody comes to the philosophical conclusion that foreknowledge, absolute divine omniscience can't exist unless determination is true. And they just come to that conclusion. They just can't fathom a way in which God could know everything and not be the determiner of evil. Then some of them will sacrifice that attribute of omniscience in order to protect what they feel like they have to protect, to understand God's character as loving and good. I don't have to do that. I don't feel that that's necessary philosophically, but I understand why some dynamic open theists feel that way in order to protect God's character. There's not an ill will that they're just trying to cast out, the Bible and throw out everything. They're actually using scriptures that seem to suggest that God's interacting in real time and that he changes his mind.
And that he gets prophecies wrong.
Seem to indicate this. I believe that Calvinism misrepresents God's character, though I do not believe Calvinists do this intentionally. The resulting effect is still the same.
These statements about God's goodness, I'm not going to go with option one. I'm not going to go with the idea that God is impeccable. There's an attribute in the nature of God. There's no verses that you're going to find about impeccability, that God cannot sin.
It's those brash statements like that'll get an eyebrow raised.
Rather than God does not sin. And typically the translations that people try to use, they'll say that it is impossible for God to lie. And that's in context of God setting up conditions, making it impossible for him to lie, which absolutely means the opposite of God's impeccable. If God has to set up situations for which it'll be impossible for him to lie, that means that God can lie. That means that God's not impeccable. Their own proof text is refuting their claims in that situation. Watch for that sleight of hand, though. They go from God does not sin to God cannot sin, and then they treat it as a metaphysical absolute rather than a subjective claim, which your mileage can vary. Atheists might say God is evil for flooding the world, and Job might say God is wrong or God is not good for all the pain and suffering that God put him through in the book of Job. And we see it written out. We see him doing those evaluations in real time. That is, as these events are happening, as he's experiencing them. He's not reflecting back on them. He's talking about what he's experiencing. Open theism. There's philosophical open theists, people like, I'd say, Hasker, people like Thomas Ord, who believe open theism for philosophical reasons. Ord, his big thing is God can't do evil. And so what does God have to do, have to be like in order to not do evil? Well, God can't be all powerful in the sense that we know as all powerful. And so he's coming to open theism from a philosophical bent, believing tenets of open theism for philosophical reasons. Whereas there's people on the other side of this spectrum who are very much interested in what the Bible actually says, who this God is that's described in the Bible, and trying to flush out those characteristics. And so a lot of times when people interact with open theists, they might have hit one type of open theist and not another, and now they're painting with a broad brush. They might have ran across Gregory Boyd. Gregory Boyd's big thing is Jesus is how we have to read the Bible. And so if God does something in the Old Testament, he kills all the Amalekites because the Amalekites have been evil to Israel historically, something like that. Then we have to reinterpret that in light of Jesus's love. And so the hermeneutic might be off-putting to some people. It's very appealing to others. But then they take their interaction with this one segment of open theism, and then they assume it on all open theists. Yeah. So the question, can God do wrong? Can God sin? Some open theists will say he is incapable of sin. Some would say, yeah, he's a person. He can do things. He has the ability to do that if he so wanted. He's a character. And in fact, if you read the Bible, there are some people within the Bible who weren't treated very nicely, like Job. Like Job, for example, like some of his prophets, like Ezekiel, Jeremiah, some of them weren't treated very nicely. And if you, however you want to categorize that, God's sometimes not very nice.
It's those brash statements like that that'll get an eyebrow raised.
Right.